following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. Did you ever buy something and have somebody, like your parents, tell you that you wasted your money? Maybe it was a ridiculously expensive pair of shoes. Or maybe you took a spring break trip that you really couldn't afford. Or maybe you bought scalper tickets to a Taylor Swift concert. Hey, I see a few bowed heads on that one. I love her too, but I would never pay scalper prices to see her. Especially if it means eating ramen noodles for the rest of the year. Well, I want to talk today about another purchase that got the same reaction that you got when you paid too much for those shoes or that trip or that concert. And that is the Alaska purchase. The year was 1867. Doesn't that sound pretentious? And the Russians needed money. And they had this chunk of land called Alaska, which they were afraid the British might take from them by war. And so they decided to unload it before that happened. And they found a buyer in U.S. Secretary of State William Seward, who bought Alaska for $7.2 million, which works out to about 2 cents an acre. 2 cents. Even then, that was nothing. It wouldn't have bought much more than a couple of licorice sticks. And it wouldn't even have been red licorice. It would have been black, and it would have been hard and stale and crusty because it wasn't wrapped in cellophane because it hadn't been invented yet. But even at that low price, it was still reviled as Seward's folly. People thought he had wasted a lot of good money on a lot of worthless land. A fifth the size of the rest of the United States, but still worthless. A land that couldn't be farmed and was too remote to have any strategic value. And yet somehow Seward thought it was a good idea to buy it. But what if he didn't? Well, here's how things went in a parallel world where America did not buy Alaska in 1867. First of all, Seward is a forgotten figure over there, like most secretaries of state. He just kind of puttered along, performing his duties until the next guy took over. For the next 30 years, things remained pretty quiet in that part of the world. Alaska remained a land of fur traders and native people where nothing notable ever happened. But then, what happened in 1896?
The gold rush?
Yes. It all began when 3 guys named George Cormack, Skookum Jim, and Tagish Charlie, don't you love those names, found gold in the Klondike region of Yukon. There as here, it led to a gold rush. But unlike here, prospectors could not enter through the Alaskan ports of Skagway and Dyea because the Russians would not permit anyone to land there. Would-be gold miners had to come in at the British Columbia port of Prince Rupert and make an arduous overland journey to the gold fields. Just like here, some got rich and most didn't. And just like here, some wondered if there was more gold to be found in Alaska. But there was no rush to go there because Russian authorities quickly closed the border to outsiders. And though that border was poorly defined and defended and not at all difficult to cross by anyone with determination, anyone who did get in found that they could not buy food or supplies or cash in their gold when they found it. So it became like snorkeling. Anyone ever do that? Yeah, I see a few hands. Well, that's what it was like. You dove in on one breath, grabbed what you could, and then came back to the surface. And really, no one had the lungs to come away rich from that. Tsar Nicholas II, however, did have the lungs. He sent troops and mining engineers to see what was there. And just like here, they found the bonanza gold beneath that old white mountain just a little southeast of Nome. Or at least where Nome is in our world. The money that came in raised the Tsar's personal wealth, but not a kopeck of it trickled down to the people. It did nothing to alleviate the unrest at home. There was still an uprising in 1905 and a revolution in 1917, just like here. But let me slam on the brakes and back the story up, because before we get to those uprisings and revolutions and the whole mess of World War I, Russia had one other major bump in the road. Anybody know what it was?
A war with Japan.
Very good. The Russo-Japanese War. A conflict pretty much forgotten in our time, but very, very important all the same. It was the first modern war fought with machine guns and entrenched positions on land, and with steam-powered battleships at sea equipped with wireless communications. The Battle of Mukden in 1905 had 610,000 participants, making it the largest battle fought up to that point in history. And when the war was over, Japan emerged as a world power, with control of several East Asian ports. And a few years later, the annexation of Korea. All that was the same there as it was here, but there was one key difference. In that world, Russia had Alaska, and Japan sent an invasion force to land troops there. It was a small fleet, but would certainly have succeeded had President Teddy Roosevelt not anticipated this development and sent the USS Ohio to intercept them. The Ohio caught the Japanese fleet as it approached the Alaskan shore on May 20th, 1905. The American ship was outnumbered and outgunned, but Captain Levitt Curtis Logan had simple orders. They shall not pass. He crossed the T on the Japanese fleet and signaled them to return home. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. Had they chosen to fight, Logan would almost certainly have lost. But he got them to back off like the Russian ships off Cuba in our world in 1962. Were the Japanese unwilling to pull America into the conflict? Or had they become aware of the Russian fleet that was steaming towards their homeland? Whichever it was, it is certain that wireless communications were a factor in the decision. The Japanese battleships moved off at full speed and got home in time to help destroy the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. The support vessels and troop transports had to go at a much slower pace, and no doubt with sullen expressions on their faces. When news reached America, public opinion was solidly behind the president. Congress praised him for his enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, and the Hearst papers touted him for keeping the yellow peril out of North America. Yes, the papers were pretty racist in those days. Japan, on the other hand, was not so happy. In our world, they wanted the United States to broker the peace treaty, and doing so won Roosevelt the Nobel Prize. Over there, they were furious at the American interference, and the treaty was hosted by Switzerland and signed in Zurich. So Russia kept Alaska into the 20th century. Do you suppose that means that in their 2024, Mr. Putin has short-range missiles aimed at Seattle and Vancouver? Well, it's time to step on the gas and move ahead to the spot where we slammed on the brakes. World War I and the Russian Revolution. There as here, Russia was on the winning side, but they still fell into revolution and the Tsar was still overthrown. In America, 1919 brought a series of strikes and bombings, some of which were influenced by Bolshevik propaganda. And President Wilson feared that a red victory in Russia would put a Bolshevik state on the North American continent. So, that summer, he sent a task force up the coast. They quickly captured Alaska, which the Russians were too busy to defend. There was some clamor in the Canadian Parliament about not being consulted, but really, most people in Canada and the United States were pleased to have the Russians off of their back porch. And no, America never did give Alaska back to the Russians after that, although it did negotiate a new border with Canada in 1922. And so, despite Seward's failure to buy Alaska, it still came to be part of America. Inevitable, right? Mr. Celsius would be pleased. Your assignment is to write a 2,000-word essay on that world. Here are some suggested topics. What were relations like between the United States and Russia after the seizure of Alaska? Or how about relations between the United States and Japan after the Ohio thwarted their invasion? What happened with the 1911 reciprocity negotiations with Canada in a world where there was not an Alaska boundary dispute in 1903? With Alaska becoming American 50 years later than it did in our world, when did they get statehood? That's due next class. Until then, stay warm and don't make any foolish purchases. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.